empresa.
Hola.
¿Qué tal funciona el micrófono?
Es que voy a usar ese.
Hola, hola, transmitiendo acá. ¿Lo estiro un poco más?
Sí, pero sí.
If it would be better for me to sit, I can.
Yes, it's okay.
It's okay.
Bueno. ¿Y tú escuchas bien cuando vayas el micrófono?
Sí.
Ya. Lo subo. Yeah, some people is coming late, but I will be here waiting for, because as we change the room, I'm noticing. So.
Yo te preguntaba si el centro de estudiantes iban a venir también.
Sí, me dijeron que iban a venir, pero
Sí.
la Gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana en la Escuela de Diseño C. Gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana en la Escuela de Diseño C. Estamos muy contentos de tener hoy día aquí entre nosotros a Carlson, que es profesor de comunicación visual, Visual Communication, en la Universidad de Notre Dame, en Estados Unidos. Clinton parte de una visita que está generada a partir del Fondo de Investigación Conjunta, entre ambas universidades. Este es un fondo que convocó, en el caso de la Universidad Católica, la Vicerrectoría de Asuntos Internacionales, y el cual fue un encuentro muy afortunado en temáticas en las cuales estamos compartiendo. Una de ellas es cómo el diseño puede activar la participación, cómo el diseño a través de su metodología, a través de sus instrumentos, puede también generar nuevas áreas de desarrollo, y una de ellas justamente es la activación de comunidades, que es lo que nos va a explicar hoy día Clinton en su presentación. Nos va a mostrar un caso se va a centrar, digamos, algunas de sus ideas en uno de los casos, uno de los proyectos en particular que ha venido trabajando en los últimos años en el área de South Bend, Indiana, que es donde la Universidad de Notre Dame se ubica. Esto es en el sector centro-noreste, cerca de Chicago, en el área de los Grandes Lagos. Bueno, me voy a cambiar ahora al inglés para poder introducir. I'm switching to English to introduce Professor Carlson. He's a Robert Sedlak Junior Associate Professor at the Visual Communication Design area. He's head of Visual Communication Design, an Associate Professor in Notre Dame, the Department of Art History, and Design, and he's a teacher and researcher there. So I was telling in Spanish before, Clinton, that we had this fortunate encounter, this fortunate meeting, to start sharing some topics, design in emergency, but also design for the activation of communities. This will be the topic that Clinton will show today. So the presentation is starting now, the projector, and you are always open to make your questions, to make your comments. You can do it in English or in Spanish, so we are translating every idea, and I'm sure that Clinton is learning Spanish really fast as she can speak. Well, thank you, Clinton, for coming here and enjoy this talk with the school.
Gracias. Buenos días. Those are, I said earlier yesterday, those are the 3 of the 36 words I know in Spanish, maybe 42 now that I know. Let me adjust this. It got restarted, and I need to change this. That is it. There we go. Perfect. Yeah.
Right?
Well, yes. We're a small group, so feel free to stop me or slow me down or ask questions. I wanted to talk today about designing what I call community activated design. It's kind of my approach as a visual communication designer to a lot of design thinking around designing for and with communities and participatory, co-creative, social innovation. So it comes from a particular visual communication standpoint. It comes from working with a lot of nonprofits and organizations over the years that are trying to do community-based work. Oftentimes in those settings, funding is small. Existing social relationships and networks and ways that ideas are diffused within that culture are far more important than the visual component. And it comes out of my observation as a designer during the HIV/AIDS crisis. I was working with World Vision, and I started to see how design wasn't working well in that context. It was taking designing for communities, and applying it across cultures in harmful ways, in ways that didn't work, didn't achieve objectives, were too costly, were not sustainable or reproducible. And so what I titled today's discussion is Design for, which is that way that design traditionally operated, where we came in as experts, we brought our skills into that environment and applied it for a product, a client, community, right? To then design with, design with, where we begin to see design that incorporates other people through human-centered approaches. Welcome. And then the last being design through, which is what I think this community-activated design falls in, where we're working through the community itself and emphasizing their relationships, their connections over design artifacts, and things like that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I just thought I would share a little bit, welcome, of kind of where this comes from. And it starts with Jorge Frascara, well-known visual communication designer. And Jorge really influenced me to look at valuing humans. And I was one of the first designers that really got me to thinking about, I remember a quote he says, we need more designers that are in love with humanity and with society and with our environment. Victor Papanek, a well-known industrial designer, really questioned a lot of the commercially driven aspects of design in the 1970s, and kind of is a foundation of that perspective of not designing for corporations, but designing for the people who have to live with what we design. Liz Sanders, a designer out of Ohio State, really evoked for me the beginnings of thinking about the value of getting people into workshops and creative environments. When we get people into the settings where they're making something, they're doing something creative, and they're maybe slightly uncomfortable, we actually get to their more meaningful thoughts and beliefs and actions around the world. And so she opened my eyes to Audrey Bennett from the University of Michigan, looks at a lot of cross-cultural communications and systems of working with communities across cultures, and helped me see the complexity that when we talk about designing for communities, especially communities that we're not a part of, it's the hardest thing we do in design, I believe. And then Ezio Manzini, of course, written a lot of around social innovation and trying to apply design in ways that actually innovates and changes culture and society. So these are some of the voices that have influenced me. These are some of the terms that we see in design that I think are in this space. For me, the question, why do I call it community activated design? It's because I think there's something in these that sometimes misses a particular visual communication, a graphic design approach, right? There's ones that are more oriented maybe to the social innovation or the act of participating with people. And for me, I always have an eye or an ear to what can be made, what can be visualized. That can be a communication piece, an artifact that can extend the conversation, not be an artifact that designs for, but designs through people. There's a couple other people that are not designers that have influenced me. Jim Knight, who works in the area of instructional coaching and how do we create a partnership within organizations, within schools for growth and development of people. And then Susan Sharp, who was at the University of Notre Dame, and her work with restorative justice. I don't know if that translates to Spanish, but it's an approach to justice systems that is not punitive, it is restorative. And so it's a very community-based approach to justice, not what we do in the United States at all. But her voice is very powerful, valid, and I think it's an important part of what I do and crosses over with that. So what I want to do today is I want to use this project that comes out of South Bend where I'm at right now. I've been working on it for about a year and a half, but it's about a 4-year project that's been evolving. And I'll use that to kind of talk about design for, design with, and design through. And to give you a little bit of history, first of all, I want to tell you the story, the background of South Bend, Indiana. This is a photo from the early 1900s, around 1904, 05, somewhere in there. We don't have a specific date. This is a photo of workers, industrial workers from a company called Studebaker. It was a car manufacturer that was really booming in the late 1800s, grew into the 1960s when it shut down. So it was the largest employer in South Bend by far. South Bend, like Detroit, was kind of a mini Detroit. It was really growing in automotive industry in the late 1800s to the 1960s. And Studebaker was a powerful employer. This photo is of Studebaker workers playing baseball. Not a lot of baseball here in Chile. I did find a club team that plays with kids here that I messaged, but I haven't heard back from them. I would love to hear what baseball's like in Chile. I couldn't find any professional players that have Chilean heritage. Obviously, it's maybe a northern Latin America thing instead. But this is men taking a break, playing baseball in a field, an open field here. This is the Studebaker buildings. They had numerous buildings. This is in 1910. They're starting to really boom. In the 1920s, this is some of their cars from the 1920s. This is a foundry that was built in 1922. And so this was part of a massive growth time period in the 1920s for Studebaker, right before the 1930s and the stock market crash. But they built massive spaces. This is a few of the workers. This was built in the US. We see what's called the Great Migration of African Americans that moved from the South, where their heritage was in slavery, they getting their freedom, and then from the late 1800s to the 1970s, there's a massive migration of millions of African Americans that moved to the North, primarily end up working in jobs like the foundry, right? They're the hardest, most dangerous spaces. They leave in this era, it's the Jim Crow South, it's post-slavery, but Jim Crow laws in the South made it legal to segregate spaces. You could have a restaurant that was for whites only. You could not use a bathroom. You could have to sit in the back of the bus. Well-documented history in the South. The Great Migration saw African Americans move north in the millions. What they encountered in the North was not that different, but it was not as explicit or stated on the surface. There was not signs necessarily, but this is Chicago in the 1920s. This is the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization that the last lynching in Indiana was in 1930. So this is this era, there's still lynchings. Our governor of the state of Indiana in the 1920s was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a card-carrying white supremacist. 1 in 6 white males that were not Irish Catholics and immigrants were members of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana. So African Americans largely come north to Chicago, Detroit, Indiana, South Bend, and encounter things like this. This is Detroit, Michigan in 1942. It's a very visceral sign of what's a white-only community, but what happens underneath this is a systemic racism of how they value properties. They had a practice called redlining that would dictate where property values were higher and lower. And the African American community, people of color, their homes were devalued. That's one of the greatest wealth enablers for people is their home value. And for decades, home values in neighborhoods where people of color were predominant were less, and it affected them enormously. This is in South Bend, Indiana. This is our public natatorium. It's no longer functioning as a swimming pool, but it was a public natatorium that was built in the early 1900s, around 1920, if I remember the date correctly. Carved in stone is the word public, right? public, although this would not be an integrated space where people of color were welcome until 1950. And so this was funded by public dollars, had the name public on it, but it was a white-only environment. It's now our Civil Rights Heritage Museum, and it's a great space that goes into the history of how people of color have faced oppression and segregation over time, both formally and informally. This is a group of men from the foundry. They were workers in the Studebaker foundry, pouring metal, pouring engine parts, and they were called the Foundry Giants. They were a baseball team. They played in 1920, so again, in this era of the KKK, in this era of still lynchings happening, they were playing against white teams. No professional sport at that time was integrated. There was no black players playing in any of our professional sports. Most of our schools were highly segregated or strictly segregated at times. But these men played against white teams within this Studebaker League. They included some very important people to our community, including Lafayette Dusty Riddle. He was the coach of this team. He became our first black policeman in 1930. In 1935, he was fired because of a change in politics. The Republican Party took over the local leadership in the community. And as this article from 1937 comments, is that Dusty Riddle blamed a racial dispute where he complained that the jail system, the penal system was putting underage youth who were African American into containment with adults. And that was against the policies. He raised his hand and said, this is against our policy, it needs to change. He was then fired. This is the accounting of it. It's very hard to get, this is from a predominantly white newspaper, so it's very hard to get some of the real story. We don't have living relatives of Dusty Riddle to tell us the story right now that we know of. He's one of several law enforcement, another gentleman by the name of, we'll talk about a little later, Alonzo Poindexter was a second law enforcement officer that was an African American. That was a long time serving one that started in 1940 as a policeman. One thing that happened in this era is these teams would play each other. So the Foundry Giants would play the other divisions within the Studebaker Corporation, but on the weekend, these corporations would make selected teams. They would take the best players and they would go play teams in Detroit and Chicago, and that was not integrated. The Foundry Giants were never welcome there. There's 6 to 7 Foundry Giants that play professionally in what we call the Negro Leagues. And they were very good ball players, but they were not welcome during the weekend that they played. I will go back to this. This is the foundry these gentlemen worked in, a massive facility. And I wanted to point out one curiosity that we discovered after we started this project, and that is that this church right here is actually the same church we see in this image. This field is actually where the foundry was built. So in early 1900s, 1905 approximately, this is where we see Studebaker men playing baseball. The foundry is built on this exact spot, and this is where the Foundry Giants do their work and serve our community. So this project is called Foundry Field. It's actually building a baseball park in the southeast neighborhood, and I'll kind of walk you through how I've applied design in different ways. The first thing is designing for communities. This is a traditional approach to design. I'm a traditional graphic designer that does branding and a variety of different things that are typical to communication design. And that would be a setting where we're designing for someone, a client, a user, an organization, or a cause, right? It's a normal way for us to go about doing design. But when we design for communities, in this case, we provide our expertise, our resources, and our knowledge to expand their story, to make it more visible. It's, I would suggest, not community-activated design yet, but it is a critical part of working for communities as we tell their story at a broader scale using the expertise of design. This can often be done in extractive ways, harmful ways, ways that go in and understand a community. We see this a lot in digital product design, right? Social media and things like that, where we go in and we understand a community. we extract knowledge about them, we create a product that goes back in and can have very detrimental effects to that community, right? So it's a dangerous thing to do in some ways. And I guess one thing that as we look at a historical project like this, is we have to recognize that this is their story. It's not my story to tell. And we've worked with the community, we've worked with the living family members of these teams, these men that we are telling the story of, and we always give them the option at any moment, you tell us what you want to share or not share, right? So we have to have care in telling other people's stories, especially when it's a story that's not yours. I'm obviously a white male. I'm second generation American or United States. My grandfather came over from Sweden. So I am not obviously a person of color. I have a lot of privilege that these gentlemen weren't afforded, right? And so recognizing that is a place to be as a designer that is very cognizant of that at all times. And I'll kind of, as we go through, I'll kind of talk about how I've tried to navigate that to be an advocate, but also not be the center of this. Our civil rights stories and history in the United States are littered with white saviors, people that take the lead in the courage of the African American community, facilitating it, but they become the story, not the African American courage. And so very cognizant of that. So here's some of the traditional things I do as a designer. This is typeface design. So we're looking at the one photo we have of the Foundry Giants. We're looking at the little tiny pixelated details we have of this R. It sticks out, the leg of it sticks out a little bit. This is it looks like kind of a slab serif or a semi-slab serif that we're looking at. We also look at the typography that's used in the newspapers at that time. These are articles about the Foundry Giants. We look at the ways that they're using the elements of type and space and line to dictate that. We also look at the technology that is available. This is the type specimen book from the American Type Foundry Company. This is from 1923. It's about 11,000 pages of type, and it could be type and ornamentation. It looks something like this. This would be supplying most of the lead type that would be used across the country in printers, local print shops. They would look through this book, select 1 or 2 or 5 typefaces with a set of ornaments that they might use for every company and every publication that they do within that community at that time. These are some of the typefaces that we looked at. Noticing some of the, if you're a graphic designer, noticing some of the slab serifs that are happening here, the narrow vertical nature of this typeface are all little details that we're doing. These sort of Gothic sans serif typefaces, and then some of the ornamentation that we see. This is translated into this typeface, this series of this type family that we utilize for the identity for this. Trying to design in a way that is inherent to the time period, to the history that we're in, the technology that we're working with in this case. This is the extended type system that we utilize for our brand. And we're, again, these typefaces reference some of the historical typeface that we looked at previously. Develop some ornamentation that resonates with that historical elements. We also do research around just what exactly was being built. This is an engine block from Studebaker. It was molded in the foundry at some point. This is a little bit older, I think. This is maybe from the 1950s. And if you look in here, this is the interior of this piece. This little element right here was a stamp that was put on every molded engine piece that was done in the foundry. It's a little better look at it here. It's a little S with this shape, this little enclosure around it. To the right is the Studebaker logo at the time. To the left is the foundry stamp. Obviously, they can't make the entire logo on the engines. They do this small little stamp. That becomes for us the logo for us. This F, we replace the S with an F, referencing Studebaker, and that creates this slot of our identity system. Again, a very traditional way of designing for a community in this case, a history in this case. We look at color. These are, this is a publication that happened in the 20th century that was a guide for African Americans for travel. Help them understand where they could eat, where they could stay, where it was friendly for them to be. It was produced for several decades, and it was called the Green Book. It was always in green. And so also in baseball tradition, these older stadiums, like this is Fenway Park in Boston, the oldest stadium we have today, the ironwork and the outfield walls were always green. And so that informs our color palette, which is an analogous sort of green color palette that we utilize. We look at some of the printing technology that existed. This is referencing more of like the 1940s and 50s printing technology using this halftone texture. We translate the diagram. This is a diagram of what this baseball field will look like in the community. These are real illustrations of some of the common artwork that was used in newspapers for advertising and things. One thing we find in this time period is that artwork was disseminated in the same way that typography was. There was one group that had them that was disseminated all over the country. Typically, those depicted people of white skin, and there was no artwork that depicted people of color. So these are retranslations trying to give a presence to African American reference in those same illustration styles that were used at that time period. Created a few other identity elements, and then website that tells a bit of the history. Develops the big challenge with this project, and the purpose of it was to raise funding for this project. It's a privately funded project, but it's on public land, and so it's a unique collaboration between our city, our Civil Rights Heritage Center, our local community, our after-school youth programs, and our public schools. A few other things that we've done from a traditional design perspective, including I'll play this short video that tells a little bit of the story of the project.
There was a time when baseball was king. Ballparks were scattered throughout South Bend. Men, women, children, neighbors, and factory workers gathered to play, to make memories, and to build community. In the 1920s, the Studebaker Industrial Baseball League was at the top of the South Bend sports page, and the Boundary Giants were often at the top of the standings. Nearly 30 years before the integration of baseball, the Giants competed against their predominantly white co-workers. Today, this kind of community baseball is mostly gone. Hyper-competitive leagues at suburban complexes and costly private tribal teams have made baseball a sport that is inaccessible for many of our youth. We hope to change that. Nestled within Southeast Park sits an underused space where we hope to build Boundary Field, a high-quality, publicly accessible diamond. Boundary Field aims to reclaim our ties to baseball, revive our urban communities, and restore the legacy of the Boundary Giants. Boundary Field will reintroduce baseball to our inner city through partnerships with the South Bend Venues Parks and Arts, the Boys and Girls Club, and South Bend Community Schools. Boundary Field will become a place for play, for youth development through the game of baseball. It will also become a place for story, rediscovering the Boundary Giants as well as other nearly forgotten histories like Uncle Bill's softball team, a Potawatomi baseball team, and how Charles Thomas inspired the integration of professional baseball here in South Bend. Boundary Field will remind us of these stories, of the strength, resilience, and courage found in our past, inspiring the next generation of community leaders that will fight to make South Bend a more inclusive and connected community.
When I was 9 years old, there was one park on the west side of town on Western Avenue called Romy Hamish Park. And it was built specifically for Black and brown people in those poor neighborhoods would have an opportunity to play the game. And it's really tough to imagine that in all these neighborhoods now, a kid doesn't have a chance to pick up baseball, be around his friends and neighbors, be around kids that he might or she might have an opportunity to go to school with.
My vision for this space 5-10 years down the road is that our kids in the summer are running over ecstatic not only to engage in programming at this field, but to also play and be a part of leagues that they're wearing their Southeast Side hats around with pride, and this is a part of my upbringing, this is part of who I was, and this is where I bonded with my dad and my mom.
All will be welcome at Boundary Field, a vibrant place to gather, play, learn, and be inspired. Rediscovering the heroes of our past and writing the next chapter in the story of our community. Boundary Field is home of the Giants.
So all of that is designing for, right? It's me bringing expertise of design, of typography, of color, of storytelling to try and evoke and tell the story of this history, but also to resonate with potential donors and with the larger community and partnerships, right? So that's design for. Quickly, I want to talk about design with, which I think is what I encountered in graduate school and then after, was designing with community. And designing with communities, there's some unique aspects of it. As designers, there's almost always a deadline, right? And it's usually too soon. It's usually tomorrow or the next day. And when we design with communities, when we truly do it with communities, the timeline is theirs. It's not ours to dictate, right? One of my partners in this, Mike Hebler with the Centers for Social Concerns, had a great quote at one point. They mentioned this is a 4-year project, right? It's 3 years of developing relationships, 1 year of actually trying to raise the money for it. And he said, as we encountered and talked to community members in different organizations that we worked with and had feedback, sometimes critical feedback of what we were hoping to do, and we had to pivot and move around. And he said, the slower we go with this project, the better this project becomes. And that's really true. We've encountered neighbors that went from being resistant because of concerns for parking to, after spending 30 minutes talking with us and hearing about it, going back to their house and to a couple neighbors and bringing us money to donate to the project. And if we were rushing, we would never have the opportunity to sit down with those neighbors. This is a broad collection of the people that we work with. SOAR is the neighborhood association that represents the local neighborhood. Venues, Parks, and Art is our parks department that owns the land. Boys and Girls Club is an after-school program that is predominantly people of color and lower income that are supported and given resources. Civil Rights Heritage Centers captures the history of civil rights in our community. South Bend Schools, again, we're in a situation in South Bend and a lot of cities in this area where the support tax dollars has degraded over the last 3 decades, support for schools, because a lot of people with wealth have exited the cities into the suburbs and created more well-funded settings. So designing with community looks, I think we see it in human-centered design. We see it in what Ezio Mazzini talks about. I want to talk last here about designing through community, which for me has a particular sense of community activation, activated design. As designers, we're experts in these things: color, typography, composition, storytelling. But when we design through communities, these things aren't that important, I don't think. They make up very small factors. In fact, they can be harmful. If we try and work with community members who are advocates and activists, if we come in with too much of a designed artifact, it cannot feel intuitive to them. It cannot feel like it's theirs, right? It can inhibit the sense of ownership. I've said this several times to many people that come to me as a designer and as a faculty member, asking me to work in a space and design for a community that I'm not a part of. Something I make, like a poster. If I in class yesterday with 20-year-old students from Santiago in the area, I said, if I design a poster, probably within a half second, most of you would recognize that a white male from a different culture made that, and you would disregard it, right? So there's an arrogance in designing for that I have enough expertise to design something to integrate, to actually impact a culture that's not mine. And then the reality is that when we design artifacts that are non-digital but physical, they usually end up in the trash in 30 days anyways. And so if we design to engage, inform, and empower community advocates, existing people that are wanting to do something, that are wanting to make an impact on their community, when we look at how we can, as designers, engage them, connect them, bring them together, give them the tools to make and visualize something that is theirs, we, I think, have the potential for incremental and sustainable change because it's more relational than it is graphic, right? This is kind of an illustration of what I think community activated design does in these approaches, to bring different advocates or activists within the community that exists and are already interested in this topic that we're looking at, in this case, race and history of labor in our community. We get them doing creative things together, making things, doing things, getting them into maybe sometimes uncomfortable settings. In doing that, we get them to think together and to talk more. And in that environment, they begin to see other advocates, and it gives them a sense of there's more people within my local community moving in this direction, wanting to make this change. And those then activists or advocates go out hopefully into the larger community. And if we can give them, in that process of doing a workshop with them, if we can create an artifact or a visualization that is in the community, that is a visible reminder of the dialogue that happened, of the goals that this group has, it can create more advocates within the community. And those advocates become much more impactful, I think. Where a poster will be in the trash in 30 days, we talk to a 6th grader, 12-year-old, who begins to talk to their parents or their peers, and a couple more people come in. They'll be there for years or decades in influencing the culture and through their citizenship and service. So this is quickly, I'll just kind of finish with this. This is a couple of things we did where, as designing through, I'm not nearly as visible in this, right? We try and let other people do the design. I'm actually not, but I'm still focused as a visual communication designer is how do we make something? How do we make something visible, right? And this is what I think is distinct to what I try and do. These are house paints. These are some stencils. We did some work. We did a workshop with the Boys and Girls Club, children that are approximately 10 to 14 years old. We asked them to work together on posters. You can kind of see them here. I had one of my students illustrate several poses of the Foundry Giants, the Spaceball team. We asked them to use the stencils and the house paints to design and create uniforms for them. It's a 2-hour workshop. Some of the local, the people that help work with the youth are there, and then you see some of the youth there working on their posters. This is a group that was left at the end as we finished up the posters. We also worked with the local high school to get their art program, and they have a restorative justice program. They came and visited the field where we were going to install these posters that were done by the Boys and Girls Club. And they're taking these, the branding, keywords of leadership, community, service, and they're creating a backdrop for those posters. This is what the final installation looks like. So it's really about what kind of dialogue can we have with those youth, with the high school students, and the people who work at the high school and at the Boys and Girls Club. It's about the dialogue that we can have around these histories, but we leave something that has a compelling visual narrative to it, has ownership. One of our favorite things to see was when we installed the posters to have the young children come and sign their names on their posters. And we saw them, I remember one of the, I think it was Roland, actually running up, that's my poster, you know. Mm-hmm. One of the boys saw last name and was like, well, that's my last name. What could be a relative, right? And that creates a sense of drama and story that has ownership. Another thing we did was we brought in an African-American mural artist. This is Thomas Detour Evans from Denver, Colorado. We had him tell the story of the Foundry Giants, work with the high school students and the Boys and Girls Club to talk about his practice as an African-American designer and the story that he's telling. This mural depicts 2 of the Foundry Giants. Alonzo Poindexter, who I mentioned earlier, one of our early Black policemen, is on the left sliding into a base. And then we create this illustration, or this full panorama at the field. This field will have the same process done for other histories. Latinx, we have some teams from the 1970s. That was a time period of a lot of immigrant labor issues in South Bend. And we will have a male and a female team depicted there. We have one of our Aboriginal tribes, the Potawatomi. We have a team you saw earlier in the video. We will have Potawatomi artists come and do that mural. And we'll continue to work with the youth from the Boys and Girls Club and from the local high schools to create that. A few photos, then we had groundbreaking. This is actually family members of Alonzo Poindexter that we didn't know existed in our community until about 2 weeks before the mural was done. This is a grandson of Alonzo Poindexter. The family, you see here, the whole family. Only one of the members knew his dad. He knew that his dad played baseball at one point. Nobody else in the family knew that their dad, they knew he was a policeman, longtime policeman. But it was a really wonderful experience to have them join. This is the local baseball team and some other community members. There's a gentleman whose dad worked in the foundry until it closed in 1960. He also played for a later iteration of this team called the Colored Giants in the 1950s. And he's now the athletic director at the local high school. Today we're building the field. We're constructing it and planting seeds and grass, and continue to have the history, and we're using social media to kind of convey that. We're planning for the next murals that will go up depicting these other underrepresented stories, and hoping that what we're doing here is replicable. So the Boys and Girls Club will continue to do this workshop that we did for them. They'll be able to do that year after year with the new children that come. They'll be able to hear the stories of Alonzo Poindexter and Dusty Riddle and the Foundry Giants over and over again. And we hope that as a practice within our community will actually activate youth and parents and leaders to make a more inclusive environment, community for South Bend. I'll end with one brief story. This is the wall prior to anything that we did. Notice it's overgrown with ivy and trees. There's graffiti on it. And we've had a lot of little moments that have been kind of magical in this project. One of them happened on my flight here, actually. I left from South Bend. My flight was going to be delayed, and I wasn't going to make my flight in Miami to come here. So I went to an earlier flight. In the day, I rushed and packed and got on a flight. Sat next to a woman who was from South Bend. She'd gone up there. And we began talking, and I asked, she said, I live on the west side, but I grew up in the southeast neighborhood. I said, oh, where in the southeast neighborhood? She said it was at Indiana and Ohio Street. I said, I don't recognize that street. She said, well, it's no longer there. She said it was taken over by Southeast Neighborhood Park. And she described exactly where her home was. And we determined that her home, this large tree, she described a large tree in her backyard. It was a small yard, smaller than this room, but there was a large tree in the yard. Her mom had planted ivy. It had grown up that tree, had crossed the alley, and the ivy had grown along a train wall. We determined that this tree was the tree in her backyard, and I'm on a flight with her here. And we tore most of that ivy down. It took us several days. But that tree is going to be on the left field line of the baseball field, and it will remain a part of this. Their last name is Turner, so we'll call the left field line the Turner foul pole. And I think there's a little bit of ivy left on one portion of the wall that I'm going to leave to honor that. She grew up in this home. It was destroyed 25 years ago to make room for this park. So there's been a lot of really little moments where the community, when we were able to go slowly, work with them, where it becomes their project, their ownership, and it's their initiative to go further with it. So that to me is community activated design, and going from designing for, with, and then through eventually, where it's not me in the lead, it's actually artists that are children and community members doing the work. So thank you.
Basically, if you have any question, feel free to ask them in Spanish or English.
Yeah, thank you very much for the cases. I was wondering if you can explain a little bit more what is the role of the process in this kind of design with or design for community, because I think that sometimes in this kind of cases, the process become more important
Yeah, very much so.
than the product, the final product. So yeah, what do you think about that sometimes I think that because in Chile we have many experience with this kind of community design-based community.
Yeah.
But the problem is that when the experience ends, the skills developed by the experience disappear.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's.
I'll actually jump up here. I have a couple little things. These are some of the things, just mindsets that I've gathered, I think, that speak to process and how. So one of the things I recognize is that visual communication design is behind many other practices, right? Other areas that have done this type of work. In the HIV/AIDS crisis, it was people doing sports projects, people from theater that were doing participatory approaches, and visual communication design is still slow to get there. And so these are some of the things that, in terms of process, that I talk about is that, your expertise is less important. The expertise of having coffee, the skills you need to have coffee with someone and have a meaningful conversation is probably much more important than your ability to handle typography or color, right? Your ability to listen and give up control, to give ownership, to find ways that you can pivot the project to align with existing advocates and initiatives that are happening and not having an agenda prior, right? Making space for dialogue and design, that's one thing I love about workshops is that we get people being creative, just giving space for community members to talk that have been lived for decades together, but are not been in an environment where they are purposefully talking about this issue or this idea or this thing. And it's maybe one of the few times where they actually have those intentional moments of dialogue and reflection. And we can help facilitate that. The idea of sustainability and reproducibility is that these contexts oftentimes have very little funding. So how do we create something? So using house paint, using a house paint that is an analogous color palette so that the students and the people who do it feel successful. Those are things they can continue to do. The next time we do this workshop, me and my students will not lead it. It will be the workers from the Boys and Girls Club. We'll probably train them before we hand off everything so that they can then continue that on and have that be a part of it. So I don't know if that kind of answers it, but there's the things that I think are important. All of these are kind of process based, right? Yeah. The last one there, of designing your exit, of being cognizant from day one of how do I not be a part of this? How do I, as a designer, walk away with it still continuing on, right? Is a process mentality and not a graphic mentality or anything. So I don't know if that clarifies it a little bit.
Yeah, completely. Thank you.
I wanted to know what's your view on the current state of design education when it comes to your approach? And you told us that, for example, for graduate school, they only work with design with, but not through the community. So how do you think about design schools and how do they handle these challenges?
It's a real challenge because design as a profession has grown enormously in the last 20 years with digital technology and product design. Right? It's brought a lot of good things in, but the practice of design, the education of design is only broadened from what Rodrigo and it was a pretty tactile process when we were studying, right? It was very graphic oriented. So we have, now the emerging technology. So it's a challenge. I think we see I would critique some programs in the US that have moved so far into kind of, I would say, non-traditional settings, that they've left the tangible skills that are unique. So you think about a T person, I don't know if you use that analogy, right? They do the horizontal exploration, but they have an abbreviated STEM. And so they don't have the depth of knowledge of what is it that I, as a designer, will be responsible for. So that's the challenge. Do we grow in the past, we just had a vertical education. But now, do we shrink this so much that we become so, these soft principles, these soft skills that are used of collaboration? It's really great, but they're also likely not the skills that early in your career will be as critical, because you're not maybe leading. They're looking for you to do your area. So I don't know that I have an answer other than to say it's a real challenge. I think about oftentimes, what do I want my students to operate, to be able to do? What do I want them to be aware of? And I want them to be aware of a lot of this, but I also don't want them to not be able to operate in the area. I've seen a lot of students in the past when I was working in industry that came from very human-centered programs, really great, but early in their career, they didn't have the depth of skill in prototyping, in telling stories. And they were the ones that oftentimes, as junior designers, that were let go. And in the end, they were very successful because they had but it took them a few years because they didn't have the depth of the tangible skill that oftentimes, I don't know that it's right, oftentimes junior designers are looking to provide.
Great.
Yes.
¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario para la presentación del equipo?
No, just it's just more a comment. For me, it's very interesting how this kind of process, this kind of hand-on process with things, with stuff, it's become a kind of political domain without ideological purpose. In the fact, what you create is a political through design. It's a kind of, and so I think this is very interesting how this kind of hand-on action plays a political role in the promotion of this, how you say, root community or bottom-up experience.
Yeah, there's, we have a long tradition of with poster design. Poster design in political and oppressive, they're oftentimes done by non-designers, and I think that activism that utilized really oftentimes rudimentary reproduction is something that design is a part of design. And I think it's a evidence of it wasn't the good design or the technology of the reproduction that mattered. It was the relationships and the activation, the flaming of passion and the unifying of a community towards something. And there was a case study 20 years ago that really influenced me in the state of Colorado. LEED certification buildings, right? LEED certification here. It's the construction of buildings for environmental conservation, and we have a LEED certification. It's a very expensive process to build a new building that's certified. And there was a new school built. It was a $70 million building, and it was LEED certified. Everything was meant to preserve energy. There was a school in the same district that a year later they looked at and it used less energy per square foot than this new LEED certified building. And they sent in a sociology professor from Colorado State to ask why. And what they found is that about 7 years prior, there was 2 faculty and anywhere from a dozen to 2 dozen students that started a club to conserve energy. And they got permission from the school board that if they could reduce their energy use from last year, the students would have a say on where that money would go. And they started reporting to the students, here's how much energy we're using per square foot compared to our others. And over 7 years, they saved over $100,000 a year in energy in that school. And it was a great sign for me of designing for a LEED certificate building, designing through a small group of people. And it was more impactful, cost tens of millions of dollars less to design through the community. And the question for me was, can design help that happen through in other places? Can I, as a designer, help design the materials or the tools that teacher who's very dynamic could hand off to another teacher that's maybe not as dynamic to do a similar thing again and again? There's a lot happening in the design for with lead certification, a lot of designers working in that space, but how do I do something that can design through?
I really like that, how there's a small gap between designing through and how something can become more political.
Yeah.
I don't know, while you were showing this project in particular, I was wondering how this project affected other communities within this city or this town. And how can, I don't know, as designers, we can work on that to not generate like a bad impact on the community, but to teach something that happened there.
Yeah. Yeah, and, this is kind of just beginning. In May, we just finished the first murals. So I'm curious to see, we know that the people who are partnering with us, that they want this to continue. There's a lot of excitement about it. We hope that this history of the great migration of African Americans into what we call the Rust Belt cities, this story could be retold for 100 cities in America, right? And probably here in Chile too, probably.
Yeah.
And so we hope that this can be an example of how other communities that are similar histories could see and learn how can we go about doing, preserving this history and activating it with our community. Not sure how that'll happen totally, as far as like how we disseminate it beyond this. A lot of people, when you're doing this type of work, there's great intention, but there's no money, and oftentimes projects start because it has good funding, and then it falls. As soon as the funding's gone, the project ends, and that's what we try and avoid with this, is how do we always invest in ways that can be reciprocal, continue on when I'm gone. If I can't do that, then I'm only doing it's not a poster for 30 days, but it's maybe a workshop for 3 months, and it's still just 3 months, right? And so how can I do something that can be repeated?
Clinton, I have a question. In your own words, how do you project these ideas of design for, with, and through into the topics that we are developing and that originates your visit here? Design for emergency, design for the future.
In your project.
Yeah.
In the project that we are conducting now.
Yeah. I think 2 ways. I think, well, I mean, I won't talk about design for, I think design with is the idea of making sure that we include in underrepresented groups in any research we do, right? And I think the public, so for instance, I think a lot of research in emergency management and response brings in the experts. And the experts try and, thank you. They try and imagine the next iteration of how they should do it. And there's obviously some bringing in of community, but how can we make more of that thinking about emergencies happen that is a habit of bringing the community alongside experts? We saw it in our workshops in South Bend where you would have an expert dictating how an emergency should happen and having a class. And we wanted to facilitate a way that they had to face the feedback from college students saying, how are you going to get volunteers to hold a sign during a mass shooting? And that was not something that they had accounted for, right? So how do we create that? So I think that's kind of using those traditional design with. I think the other is designing through. How do we create like a toolkit that any community globally could take materials that are the kit that we're working on and testing, can that be a kit that a community dealing with, wildfires, tsunami, earthquake could use? Because it's all about the dialogue, right? It's not about this.
Yeah.
We're just giving them a reason to be together, to have a conversation, and can we create something that can help facilitate that, so that it has nothing to do with what we give them. It's just that facilitates the meaningful things in the dialogue that helps them think about, you know what, we've never really experienced a wildfire, but now with global warming, we see that as a potential. Let's talk about what that looks like. One of the striking things I cautioned Rodrigo on when he came, Tuco, sorry, when he came to South Bend and we did workshops there, I said, be aware that likely the majority of groups will want to talk about active shooters, people with guns, as the emergency. And that was really true. I think over half of the groups focused on active shooters as their emergency.
Wow.
He warned me when we came here that likely nobody would choose active shooting as an emergency.
A lot of people talking about wildfires or earthquakes.
Yes. So, I think both those things are happening in what we're doing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana. Thank you, Clinton, again for your time. And I hope that this is just the first time here
I hope so too.
about maybe. Before to Argentina.